Comparing Canada to what it was 500 years ago would be really difficult. The immense changes the nation has accumulated over the time frame makes it almost irrecognizable to what it was prior. One major event transitioned Canada into its current state, and that was the first contact between European settlers and the Indigenous community. But what happened at first contact, and how has that led to what we are today? To answer this, we need to trace back over 500 years ago to truly understand what happened. The first contact between Indigenous people and Europeans happened in the 1500s and was mostly through French traders and explorers. The first groups to build relationships with the French were the Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Haudenosaunee, who traded with the French and shared their knowledge of land, hunting, and survival. However, even early on, these relationships had some risk involved. Indigenous economies started depending on European goods, resulting in the Indigenous to slowly shift from their traditional ways. The arrival of Europeans also came with diseases, with smallpox being the most notable and killing the Indigenous who lacked immunity between the 1600s to 1800s. In some regions, mortality rates reached 90%, with entire communities ceasing to exist entirely. Epidemics not only killed people but broke cultural links, disrupted governance, and added to the future trauma of the Indigenous. After the 7 Years' War, the British created the Royal Proclamation of 1763 that recognized Indigenous land rights and disallowed settlers to take land without agreements. It seemed like progress initially in the European Indigenous relationships, but it instead allowed the Europeans to take more control. Over time, Indigenous culture and power were ignored, and the proclamation was used to justify colonization. The Indian Act was passed in Canada in 1876 and was made to take control of every part of Indigenous life, such as status, land, culture, etc. Leaders were replaced with government-approved band councils, and cultural practices like ceremonies were banned. It took away many communities' control over their resources and was a really traumatizing time for the Indigenous mentally and socially. Residential schools were one of the darkest times for the Indigenous and spanned between 1880s to 1996. Its purpose was to force Indigenous children to unlearn their languages and culture, and subjected children to horrible abuse. Reports of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse were common, and loss of language and culture distanced families, with many children never returning homes and ever seeing their families again. After the Northwest Resistance, the pass system was created in 1885 and lasted all the way up till 1941. Indigenous people on reserves were required written permission from an Indian agent to leave. The system was not a law but an unofficial policy. However, it restricted their mobility, access to resources, and healthcare. It had negative economical effects as well, with people being cut from jobs whilst also creating mental and social trauma by isolating entire communities. The 60s Scoop took place between the 1960s and 80s, where thousands of Indigenous youth were separated from their families and placed in non-Indigenous foster homes. This policy continued the ultimate goal of assimilation following the period of residential schools. Language and cultural barriers were created between children and their families and communities, affecting their mental health and identity. The Oka crisis in 1990 occurred when a golf course expansion resulted in a 78-day standoff in Oka, Quebec. The Mohawk Nation protested against the project as it would remove sacred burial grounds. The crisis exposed the prolonged issue of land disputes that made Canadians really think about the reality of European brutality against the First Nations. It also invited conversations about sovereignty and police violence. Canada created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2008 to research the history of residential schools through survivor testimonies and of abuse and pain. The Commission's 94 calls of action created change in fields like child welfare, education, health, and justice. Overall, the Commission highlights that reconciliation is not a single event, but instead a long-term process. Canada was able to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or also known as UNDRIP, in 2021. This event was a big turning point for the Indigenous as it recognizes their rights to land, governance, and self-determination. The biggest challenge now is how far institutions will go to actually take action instead of saying a bunch of words. Where we are in Canada now is quite complicated. Colonialism's history runs strong, but the same can be said for Indigenous resistance and resilience. Communities across the country are taking back their land, language, and identity, but the timeline still continuing and completely depending on how much we do not want history to repeat itself.